So as Catherine mentioned, I am a bike fitter and a physical therapist. And as a physical therapist, I specialize in working with people with orthopedic dysfunction and pelvic floor dysfunction. And as a bike fitter, I work with cyclists of all ages and all ability levels. So I work with road and gravel cyclists, mountain bikers, a lot of triathletes, ranging from first-time newbies all the way up through very experienced bike packers and semi-professional and professional triathletes. And like Catherine mentioned, I think the approach that I take is a little unique because of my clinical background. And I'm going to talk about that approach a little bit, and then how we're going to divide up what we talk about today and what we talk about in our next meeting. The way I approach a bike fit is often when someone's coming to me for a bike fit, they're coming with a specific complaint. And that complaint could either be that they have, for example, knee pain or neck pain or a specific ailment, or it could be a performance-related complaint. And so the performance-related complaint could be that, you know, they feel like they're underperforming on the bike compared to what they feel their training should yield for them, or maybe they've even had physiological testing and their performances are not matching their physical capabilities. And a bike fit can be very useful in helping those people as well. But for everyone that I do a bike fit with, my biggest job is to first and foremost listen to the client and hear and figure out what they want to achieve out of that bike fit, which is often going to be a complaint. And secondly, to answer the question, what is driving that complaint? What is driving the reason that they're coming in to see me? And if we can, I typically group those drivers into two categories. The first category is going to be bike fit and bike position. And so those are components that can be fixed within a bike fit process. The second group is going to be intrinsic variables, what I call intrinsic variables, which are our, for example, our strength, our physical strength, our muscular stability, our flexibility, our fitness and power, and our ergonomics and pedaling mechanics on the bike. And most people have a combination of those two drivers contributing to their specific problem. And depending what the problem is, they might have a different mix of, for example, their body's driving more of it, and that might recommend that they do these things off the bike first. Or maybe their bike fit is really the driving issue of their problem, and that needs to be addressed before anything else can change. And so I think I'm going to start by talking about what proper ergonomics and position on the bike should look like, and then we'll get into saddle fit, because everything, in my opinion, starts and finishes with the saddle. And from there, we'll start talking about what are some common complaints that people have and how those can be contributed to by poor position, poor saddle, and so on. And so if we start with proper position on the bike, I hope you can see my gravel bike behind me. The main things that we're looking for in a proper position on the bike, on a gravel bike, for example, is that someone is able to position their pelvis so that they are not posteriorly tilted like this, okay? So they're not what I call sitting in the back seat, but they're able to rotate the pelvis forward. And so there's a nice balance of weight between the sit bones in the back and the pubic bones in the front. And in the upper body, there should be around a 90-degree angle in the shoulder. And so that's the angle between the upper arm here and the thorax there. There are good reasons that some people ride with more than that. There are very few good reasons why people would want to ride with less than that, unless they have some physical limitation. But generally, most people are going to be most comfortable on that 90-degree angle. And what that allows to happen is the weight from your upper body to be transferred nice and squarely down the length of the arm. And so that as your upper body is relaxing down into the bike, your arms can support that weight. And as we work down the chain, and you have that nice around 90-degree angle here, and the elbows are slightly relaxed. They don't have to be bent like you're mountain biking, but they certainly shouldn't be locked out. You have a nice relaxed elbow. That is going to help to keep the wrists in a nice neutral position, so you're not cocked too far that way, or too far like that, or like this. And it allows your upper body, most importantly, to sink down into the shoulder girdle so you're not holding yourself up like this. When the upper body is relaxed, it alleviates some of the weight in your hands. It also allows you to extend your neck and look down the road, which is where you're going to be looking, without having a lot of tension, which can be caused if you're holding your body up like this. And so if we start with what we know is that good ergonomic position on the bike, and then we start talking about what are the things that can contribute to throwing those ergonomics off. The first and foremost, the biggest problem that I see and the biggest complaint that I hear from people is that they have saddle pain. And that could present as saddle sores. It could present as back pain. It could even present as hand numbness, and I'll get to that in a minute. But being able to sit comfortably in the saddle is really crucial to be able to have proper ergonomics in the bike and to be able to put good amount of power into the pedals. And so I know a couple of you asked this question on the forum about how to choose a bike saddle. And I should qualify this by saying that picking the best bike saddle for you should really go hand in hand with the bike fit. So for example, you can be sitting on the saddle that is really perfect for you, but if the rest of your bike position is faulty and it's dysfunctional, then that saddle is still going to be uncomfortable for you. And so if you have already had a bike fit and you know your position is generally in the ballpark and your saddle is still uncomfortable, that would be a good time to try other saddles. If you have never had a bike fit and your saddle is uncomfortable, start with the bike fit, and the saddle fitting should go hand in hand with that bike fit. So your fitter should allow you to try different saddles in that process so that you kind of check off two boxes at the same time. But the three components we need to consider when choosing the right bike saddle are your morphology, which is your body structure and shape. And this is going to determine the width of the rear of the saddle and the width of the nose of the saddle. And the width of the rear of the saddle should be determined by how wide your sit bones are. And those are your bones you're sitting on when you're sitting in upright good posture. Those bones are contacting your chair or your bike saddle. Those bones need to be supported on top of the saddle. They shouldn't be falling off the sides. And so if you're sitting on a bike saddle, you can either have someone at home or in the bike shop, once bike shops are open again, you can have someone feel if those sit bones are actually on the saddle or if they're falling off the sides. You yourself can even feel. You can sit up when you're riding and you can reach back for those bones. If you feel them falling off the sides, then your saddle's too narrow. And then the width of the nose of the saddle is pretty intuitive. If the saddle is too wide for you, which is an issue that many women have, then the nose of the saddle is going to be rubbing and chafing on the inside of the thighs, and that can cause all kinds of chafing and saddle sores and so on. And so figuring out the right width of the saddle is the first step. The next step, like I mentioned, is making sure that your bike position is appropriate as you're choosing that bike saddle. So for example, if you have a saddle that's the proper width for you, but your bike is set up so that you have, let's say, a very long reach to the handlebars. And the reach is the distance between the nose of the saddle here and the contact point of your hand, which is usually going to be the brake hood. If that length, that reach is too long, that's going to cause you to reach out like this. And that is going to put your back in a position where you just curled it under. It makes it more difficult to rotate forward like this. And that in turn can change where the pressure is on the saddle. Another way in which your bike position can alter the saddle that's appropriate for you is if you're someone who likes to ride with a lot of drop, for example. Let's say you are riding with the handlebar much lower than the saddle. And so drop is measured from the top of the saddle to the top of the handlebar. If the handlebar is very low, that is going to cause you to rotate forward on the saddle, put a lot of pressure down on the hands, but also put a lot of pressure in the front of the saddle on the pubic bones. And if you don't have appropriate padding under the pubic bones, that's going to cause a problem. And then the third consideration when picking a saddle is being aware of your intrinsic variables. So for example, if you're someone who is very flexible and you're able to sit in that rotated forward position of the pelvis, you're inherently going to have more pressure under your pubic bones. And so you're someone who needs good padding in the nose of the saddle. You probably also need a cutout in the nose of the saddle as well. And that cutout can vary in size and shape, but sitting on the saddle is really crucial to be able to feel that, or hopefully not feel it, because that's not pressure you want in the center of the pubic bones. You want the pressure to be underneath the bone so you have good bony support for the pelvis. On the opposite side of that, if you're someone who is very, very stiff, you're going to be sitting more rocked back with a posterior pelvic tilt. And so you're going to be probably sitting more like this in the saddle. More weight will be under the sit bones here. And that means that you need good cushioning and good support underneath the rear of the saddle. And so you might need a little bit more cushioning there. And people with that body type often prefer a saddle that is nice and flat. They don't care if there's a cutout or not, and they often don't like the feeling of a cutout, but they do like to have a nice flat, wide saddle so they have good support underneath the sit bones. And so those are some key things to look at when you're finding a saddle. There are millions of saddles out there. I don't subscribe to the idea that that every woman needs a woman's saddle, but I do think that it's imperative that you try different saddles and that someone helps to coach you in how to properly sit on the saddle so you can determine if the saddle you're on is right or not. But I hope those give some good guidelines to start if you don't have access to a bike fitter and you know your bike position is in the general ballpark of where it should be, then trying different saddles with, let's say, if you're very flexible, a bigger cutout might be helpful for you, or more padding. I'm very partial to the Cellitalia saddles, and on their website, they have a nice delineation between the different levels of padding they offer, and they also have delineations between the flat saddles for less flexible people, and then trending into saddles with a bigger cutout for more flexible people who have more pressure on the nose of the saddle. And so that might be a good resource for you. And that brings me to my next point. What is, and this was a question that was posed to the group, what is normal discomfort on a saddle and what is abnormal discomfort? And as you all know, because you're cyclists, there is no such thing as the most comfortable bike seat ever. There might be for the first 30 minutes, but no bike saddle is going to be as comfortable as sitting in your favorite couch. So recognizing that bike saddles should be firm and they should create pressure under the pelvis is normal. I would say that it is not abnormal, so I would say it's normal if you experience some numbness when you're sitting in the saddle for a prolonged period, if you're not standing up, as long as that numbness goes away immediately when you stand up on the pedals or you get off the bike. Abnormal findings would be saddle sores, first and foremost. And I'm not talking about chafing that might be the result of not using chamois cream or of, let's say, poorly fitting shorts. But saddle sores that are such like a blood blister, particularly saddle sores that are asymmetrical. And so if you always get saddle sores on your right side, that is a very clear indication that someone has some intrinsic imbalances. And those are often seen as asymmetrical stiffness, particularly in the hips or the back, or of a strength difference. If the right leg is much stronger than the left, for example, you're going to be pushing more with that right leg. And that can change how you're rocking on the saddle or even sitting on the saddle. You might be sitting off to the side of the saddle. And so saddle sores are definitely abnormal. And I'm talking about really more the big blood blisters that create pressure. Asymmetrical saddle sores can be caused by our own asymmetries. Symmetrical saddle sores are often caused by a saddle that's just incorrect for you. It's not the right saddle for you, or a saddle that is too high. Your saddle head's too high, so you're having to rock on the saddle and reach for the pedals at the bottom of your pedal stroke. Another two common finding I would say, particularly in women that are abnormal, would be numbness that does not alleviate when you get off the bike. It lingers, and it might linger for 15 minutes. It might linger for a couple hours, even more than a day. That is abnormal. And swelling in the vulva that does not alleviate within 15 or 20 or maybe even 30 minutes after getting off the bike. And things to look out for would be if you have swelling that is getting worse on back-to-back ride days. And so if you ride on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, by Wednesday the swelling is sticking around for much longer and it's not clearing out. Those can be indications that you might have some lymphatic backup, and that could be a function of improperly fitting shorts. It could be a function of some intrinsic deficits that need to be addressed by a physical therapist. It could be a sign of improper bike fit or improper saddle. And the only other thing I'd like to mention about bike saddles is the difference between riding indoors and outdoors. Because when you're riding outdoors, your body is rocking slightly with every pedal stroke. Depending on how good your pedaling technique is, it might be rocking more or less. And when you're rocking outside, the bike is rocking with you. And so your pelvis and the bike seat are going with one another. When you're inside and your bike is fixed on a trainer, or if you're on a stationary bike like one of the new Wahoo bikes or on a Peloton, your body is now moving over this fixed saddle. And so now all that chafing that is going to occur between these two surfaces, and that often predisposes people to getting saddle sores when they ride indoors. This is particularly pronounced for people who have bad core stability. And so if you're not able to hold yourself still on the saddle while you're pedaling, that discomfort is going to be much more pronounced when you're inside. You can even see it. And I would say the only other contributing factor to those saddle sores would be a saddle height that's too high. Most people that I come in contact with for a bike fit have a saddle that's too low, but for people who have the saddle set too high, that can also cause all of these saddle problems and saddle sores as well. And so if we continue to think about the proper positioning of your body on top of the bike and how deviations in those proper ergonomics can cause some of these common complaints, if we start with the upper body, and I'm going to group the neck and the shoulders and the upper back and even the wrists and the hands together because they all influence one another. If someone's having hand pain or hand numbness, or even neck pain or upper back pain or burning, these are often a result of inability to maintain that proper position on the bike. So, like I mentioned before, if your reach is too long, so if you're maybe 100 degrees or even more stretched out in your shoulder angle here, what's going to happen is when you try and extend your neck, you're going to run into a bony block. And so your shoulders, because they're slightly elevated, are actually restricting your upper back from extending, which is in turn restricting you from extending your neck as much as you need to be able to. You can even try this at home. If you bring your arms back to about a 90-degree square angle, you'll feel the joints of your neck open up. And so if your reach to the handlebar is too long, that is a big, big driver of neck pain. If your drop to the handlebar is too great, that is also a big driver of neck pain and of hand numbness because there's too much weight on the hands. And so if you can have someone look at you at home, or if you can look at yourself in the mirror when you're at the trainer, if your shoulder is way stretched out, you might need to shorten the reach. And if you certainly have more than 10 centimeters of drop down here, I would say that's probably more drop than you need as a gravel cyclist for the vast majority of us. Most people are going to be more comfortable with much less than that. Some of the intrinsic factors that could drive the neck tightness and the chest tightness, hand numbness, and so on would be if the if someone is lacking muscular stability of the neck and of the shoulder blade muscles, because as much as we are aware of good ergonomics and position on the bike, if those muscles don't have great endurance, when we get 2 hours and 3 hours into a ride, if those muscles are fatigued and they can no longer hold you in that proper position, then all of this is for naught. And so identifying if someone has the proper endurance to even hold that position is key. And giving them the bike fit and setting up the bike to allow them to hold the best position possible for as long as they want to be able to ride is the other component of that. And so if we move down the chain to knee pain, I would say knee pain is probably one of the second most common complaint when someone comes in with kind of a pain or an injury complaint. And the most common complaint I hear is that someone has anterior knee pain or knee pain in the front of the kneecap or around the kneecap, for example. In terms of the bike position, contributing factors to that could be that the saddle's too low, or that the saddle is not appropriately supporting their body. So proper saddle height, if you can see my pedal here, should be measured when your foot is at the furthest point away from you in the pedal stroke. So that's actually not going to be at 6 o'clock, but it's going to be slightly before that because your saddle is back behind the bottom bracket. And so when you're reaching out, when your foot is at its bottommost point, this is the maximum extension of the knee. And we aim for the knee angle to be about 35 to 40 degrees bent. And so if straight is 0 degrees, that's 10, that's 20, and that's 30 more or less. The knee should be relaxed and bent around 35, 40 degrees when your foot is furthest away from you. That's something you can see if you're by yourself in a mirror, if you're running on a trainer, or you can have someone help and measure that. But if the saddle is much too low, and let's say that knee angle is around 50 degrees or 55 degrees, the knee cap is always going to be compressed against the femur, and it's not allowing it to stretch out and get less pressure between and decrease the pressure between those two bones, and that can be a driver of knee pain. If someone is experiencing pain on the outside of the knee on the bike, this is often a function of the saddle being too high. And so right here on the outside of the knee is an area where the IT band, which is a long fibrous band on the outside of the leg, crosses the knee. And as you straighten the knee out, that band, as you straighten it fully, it rolls over a bony protuberance. And if you straighten the knee more than 30 degrees, the IT band is going to be running over that bony protuberance every pedal stroke, and that can lead to some irritation and pain in the outside of the knee. And it's a very similar situation with the back of the knee. If someone's having pain in the back of the knee when they're riding, it's often a function of the saddle being too high. And for all of these, a big driver of knee pain in the bike can be incorrect cleat position, which I hope to get to in a moment as well. If we keep with the common complaints, I would say maybe the third most common complaint that I hear is of pelvic and low back pain, which are very closely related to proper saddle position and saddle setup and saddle choice. Functions on the bike, factors in the bike fit that can contribute to pelvic and back pain, or if the saddle is too high. If the saddle is too far back behind the bottom bracket, causing you to ride in kind of a Superman position. So for example, if the saddle is too far back like this, it's going to cause you to stretch out. It's going to cause you to round your pelvis back like this. And that puts the back in a vulnerable position. When you're asking the legs to put out a large amount of power, when your pelvis is like this, it's a very unusual and abnormal position for the pelvis. And so we're able to generate the most amount of power from the the glutes and the legs when the pelvis is in neutral position, which on a bike seat is going to be slightly tipped forward. And so if you're unable to sit that way and you're sitting back like this, that can be a big contributor to sacroiliac joint pain, low back pain, and hip pain. And of course, imbalances around the hips and imbalances around the core musculature and imbalance between the glutes and the quads and the hamstrings can play a huge, huge role in knee pain and pelvic pain on the bike. I would say that in my experience, intrinsic variables are bigger drivers of lower body pain in cyclists, and bike fit errors or faulty bike position are bigger drivers of upper body discomfort and upper body pain. Catherine, do we have time to talk about cleat placement? Okay. So, moving all the way down to the feet, I wanted to brush on this because there are a couple questions about it. I'm going to keep trying to get out of the sun here. The sun is chasing me. Cleat placement is something that is easiest done if you have someone to help you. But if you don't, you can at least get it in the right ballpark. And if you've never had a cleat fitting, then this might solve your problem right here and then. So the best way to set up your cleats is to start with your shoe. And if we're talking to gravel cycling, we're talking about gravel cycling, most of you are going to be on an SPD style shoe. And so I ride egg beaters, and you can see my cleat is right here. I have a cleat protector plate underneath it, which is just going to protect the carbon sole of the shoe from the pedal, so it doesn't wear a groove in my shoe, which I have had happen before. And so the way you're going to start your cleat fitting is you're actually going to put your shoe on, and before you do that, I'm going to show you what you're looking for. So you look down at my feet here. Once your shoe is on, you're going to be standing up in your shoes so that your weight is on the floor, and you're looking for the knuckle of the first ray or the first toe and the knuckle of the fifth ray or the fifth toe. And so for me, it's pretty obvious because I have this big bunion. When your shoe is on, you're going to be looking for that knuckle, and you're going to make a little Sharpie mark or put a sticker right there on the shoe. And you're also going to make the same on the outside. And so if I put on my shoe for a demonstration, tighten it up. I put in a Sharpie. I can feel that knuckle right there. And I'm going to make a little mark on the sole of the shoe, right where that goes. And I'm going to do the same on the outside. So I'm not marking the toe, but rather the joint right behind the toe. And then I'll take my shoe off. And I have these marks. That one's hard to see, this one's easy to see. And where my fingernails are the furthest point forward, and the furthest point back you would place that cleat. Ideally, you want the center of the cleat in between or within that range, that fore-aft zone. And so that zone is where you're able to transfer power most effectively between your foot and the pedal. That's going to be the ball of your foot. And so you want the center of that cleat in between that range. So that's the first step. The next step is to determine where your feet want to go in a normal real life situation. So, for example, if you have a full-length mirror and you have a hallway, you can walk down that hallway and watch your feet as you're doing it. If your feet face straight ahead, And if you do a squat in front of that mirror and your feet are still facing straight ahead, and you're aware that when you run, your feet go straight ahead, then you want to set up your cleats so that your feet go straight ahead on the bike. If, however, you're someone whose feet are maybe even 1 foot, toes out like this, and you squat and your arch collapses and your toes are out here, and you run and you always scuff the inside of your heel against one calf, for example, you come back and the insides of your calves are all muddy, or maybe just one is muddy, then you don't want to set up your cleat so that it's locked forward, because you function in real life with your foot out there. And if you all of a sudden lock your foot into a position where it's stuck forward, your knee is going to protest and it's going to be very unhappy with you after not very long. So you can do that by either watching yourself walk, watching yourself squat in front of the mirror, or the quick and dirty way, if you don't want to do anything like that, is to just hop up and down in place, hop, hop, hop. When you land, what are your feet doing? Are they facing straight ahead, or are they like this? And so that's your guide for where your feet want to be on the bike, okay? Your knees want to travel forward, but for some of you, your feet may want to go out like that. For some of you, your feet may want to toe in a little bit. That is going to dictate how you set the rotation of the cleat. So if you're someone who toes out, this is the right shoe, the right foot. If you're someone who's toeing out when you're walking, running, and jumping, that means that the cleat underneath the shoe is going to be relatively rotated in, like this. It's easiest to adjust this if you put the shoe like this. Imagine where the cleat is, turn it over, and see what your hand is doing, okay? When you turn it over, it will be opposite, so just keep that in mind. So I, for example, want my foot straight ahead. That means when I set the cleat, I want it pretty much straight through the second toe. And so if I look at my cleat, it's pretty much facing straight ahead. Mine is even toed in, or sorry, out a little bit so that I'm toed in. That's the position that's most comfortable for me. Rotation takes a little bit of trial and error. I would say those two components are the most easy adjustments you can do to cleat fit on your own. If you have specific complaints on the bike related to your feet, so for example, if you're someone that has a very flexible foot, and you would know that because when you walk, you can see your arch completely collapse and hopefully recoil a lot as you're walking. If you're someone who, has been told you overpronate, or someone who wears orthotics in their normal shoes or their running shoes, you might benefit from an orthotic in your cycling shoe as well. I have found that people that benefit most from orthotics are people who have a very flexible foot, because a flexible foot needs support. In the real world, you get that support from your musculature. In a cycling shoe, your foot is not going through the normal gait cycle. The arch is not collapsing and recoiling. And so that foot is being taxed a lot through the course of a 3-hour ride. And so if you have a really flexible foot, you might benefit from an orthotic that you can buy off the shelf. For example, this is an Align orthotic. It's a rigid orthotic made for cycling. The reason I like these off the shelf is they have a nice big arch support, and most importantly, they have a metatarsal pad here. And that is crucial when you're looking for an insole for a cycling shoe. If you're someone who has a flexible foot and you have an insole that only supports the arch, you're missing the boat. You need support under the metatarsal heads, which is the arch that is formed by the joints just behind the toes, so that when you're putting pressure down into the ball of the foot, which is going to be around here, the metatarsal arch is supported. That's the arch that's going to support, that is going to collapse most when you're cycling. And so the Align orthotic have that pad. This is the orthotic that came in my shoes. It has a soft, flexible metatarsal pad, which I guess is better than nothing. The problem with this one is that it's way too far back. My metatarsal arch is up here. This pad is back here. So they kind of missed the boat with this one. Another option would be to get a custom orthotic and to make sure the orthotist that builds it puts in a metatarsal pad. It's hard to see because this is a multicolor one, but there is a bump right here that supports the metatarsal arch. You can also play around with metatarsal pads or metatarsal buttons, which are just adhesive stickers that you could stick to an insole, and I've had some moderate success with those. I would say another common complaint I get when it comes to cleat position and foot discomfort would be numbness in the feet. And if the cleats are set up properly, if you go through those steps and you're still having numbness, depending on where you're having numbness can really drive what we do about it. So for example, if you're having numbness on the outside of the foot, on the little toes out here, and you know that you're someone who has a flexible foot, you might need an orthotic in the shoe. If you are having numbness in the outside of the foot here, and you have a rigid foot, if you jump up and down and you walk and you have, your arch is not collapsing that much, or if you look at your footprints in the sand and you have a huge arch compared to your friends, then you probably need a little bit of wedging underneath the cleat. And that's something I would definitely see a bike fitter for. I wouldn't necessarily play around with that yourself at home, because doing too much wedging can really wreak havoc on the knees. And I've seen people get a lot worse by using wedging when it's maybe not indicated. So I would be very cautious and talk to someone who knows what to do about that, or knows how to properly use wedging before playing around with it on your own. And I think that gets us through most of the questions. The only other thing I jotted down that there was a question about when it comes to cleat placement is how to properly set up a cleat for an endurance rider. I would follow all those same steps for an endurance rider. The only two extra things I might say about that, and I'm assuming an endurance rider is someone who's doing, long bike packing tours, for example, or who's really on the bike in the saddle hours and hours and hours at a time, 4, 6 hours, that kind of thing. The considerations for an endurance cyclist like that, I would say, would be that you might want to err on having the cleat slightly further back on the shoe, back towards the heel, because that will limit the length of the lever arm that the foot and the shoe make up on the bike, and that will in turn alleviate some of the workload on the calf. And so if you're doing these long races and long events, you might consider keeping that cleat as far back as it will go. Now with an SPD style cleat, you're going to be limited by the shoe and how far back you can go. I have seen people custom drill holes in a shoe to get that cleat really far back, even under the instep. And some of these really long distance riders have great success with that. So it really depends on if you're having specific symptoms. If you're someone who gets Achilles pain or calf cramping in these long races, you might want to consider putting that cleat further back. Otherwise, for an endurance cyclist, I would consider getting an orthotic in that shoe. If you're not someone who's having foot problems per se as an endurance cyclist, you could even get a soft orthotic just to try to equalize the pressure of the foot pushing down on the pedal when you're riding. And there are a lot of brands that offer good soft orthotics. Specialized has 3 different orthotics you can choose from, and a number of other brands do as well. And so that might be a nice option. And I think that's most of the questions that we got. And hopefully that answers some general questions and general, I would say, general questions about how bike fit and can influence some of these problems and complaints. And hopefully some things you can do about them when you're stuck at home without access to a bike fitter.
That was awesome, Chloe. By the way, Michelle Holbrook says, hi, we miss you.
Hey, Michelle.
So one question, if anybody has questions, you can post them. We'll take a couple more minutes. But I had a question for you of how do people find a good bike fitter? So if you're not in a big city, There are lots of people also that call themselves a bike fitter, but maybe they don't have any formal training. So, and then, sometimes you're not super comfortable talking to a male bike fitter about some of the issues you're having. So how can people find a good bike fitter?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, unfortunately, there is a lot of variability in the training and expertise that bike fitters have. There are not great standards for training and certification that fitters have. And it's kind of like personal training. I mean, you can take a weekend class and call yourself a personal trainer or a bike fitter. You might have only anecdotal experience in a bike shop as a mechanic and call yourself a bike fitter. On the flip side, you can have people who have studied biomechanics, have advanced degrees, present all over the world and do research. And obviously those are going to be the more qualified and well-versed bike fitters. I think that I would start by seeing if you have anyone local. If you've never had a bike fit and there is a bike fitter or a couple of bike fitters local to you, I would definitely start there. A couple of good questions, I would organize your questions, kind of like going to the doctor, organize your questions before you go there. And jot them down and make sure that those questions are addressed in your session. Or if you're unsure of who to choose, jot down those concerns and those questions beforehand, and you can vet a bike fitter by asking those questions and saying, are these things you're comfortable addressing? Are you comfortable working with someone like me and, with these specific concerns? And ask those questions beforehand. I would also ask about your access to follow-up appointments and adjustments after the bike fit, because those are crucial. The best bike fitter in the world still needs feedback from the client. And so you make these changes to the bike position and you might be in the general ballpark, but there will most likely be small adjustments that need to be made after someone goes out and tries the new position for a couple of weeks. And so make sure that the fit you're getting includes follow-up appointments and adjustments, and that that person is willing to hear you and work with you as you give them feedback. And the more feedback you can give that fitter and the more accurate and specific your feedback is, the better. Unfortunately, if you're uncomfortable speaking with, for example, a male fitter and there's not a female fitter available, I'm always available as a resource. And in the future, I plan on offering remote consultations in regards to complaints on the bike. And those complaints might be physical complaints. I have pain, I have saddle sores or what have you, or a numb foot, or they might be I'm not quite sure where to start. I'm new to cycling and I don't know if I need a bike fit or not. Or it could be, I'm training for this new race or this new event. I'm taking this, 10-day bike packing trip and I don't know if I need to make any adjustments before that. So I can always be a sounding board. And in the future, as I get my website up, I hope to have more formalized consultations where I can actually look at people on their bikes and hopefully be a resource for people in that way as well.
Awesome. We did have another question come in about toe numbness. What if your big toe is getting numb rather than the outside of your foot?
Big toe numbness, I would say the most common causes of big toe numbness would be if the cleat is too far forward. And so if the cleat is too far underneath the front of the toes, that can cause big toe numbness. If the cleat is too far underneath the big toe, that can also cause big toe numbness. And so one thing I didn't mention, because it's very hard to adjust on your own if you don't have someone else looking at you and knowing what to look at. Once you adjust the cleat position fore aft and you adjust the rotation, which are the easiest things to do on your own, you also have the ability to move the cleat in or out. When you move, if you hold the shoe like this, when you move the cleat in, that is going to bring the foot relatively out away from the bike. It's also going to put more weight underneath the big toe, okay? And so if you're having numbness under that first toe, you can try moving the cleat out. It might be that the cleat is too far in and it's not balanced underneath the width of the shoe. And so try moving the cleat out toward the little toe that way a little bit. That can also help. If you're having numbness under the big toe and those two things don't work, moving the cleat back and moving the cleat out, the next thing I would recommend would be trying an orthotic.
Awesome.
There was one more question that someone posed to the group about how to distribute gear on the bike, and I'm assuming that's for a bike packing trip. And this is a real quick answer, so I'll try to answer it now. The best way to pack gear is to keep it off your body and to keep it on the bike so that you don't have to hold the weight on your shoulders and your arms, which will lead to over time neck and shoulder pain. Wearing a backpack also increases how much weight's on the saddle, so that can cause more saddle problems. And so whenever possible, try to keep the weight on the bike and keep the weight centered on the bike. And so that would mean centered within the frame, in a frame bag for the heavy stuff, and centered low to the ground so that the handling is not adversely affected too much. And those are probably your biggest points. Your bulkier things that are lightweight, like a sleeping bag or a puffy jacket, you can throw in either your handlebar roll or a larger saddlebag. And when you're packing your saddlebag, make sure to put the heavy things in first so they're close to the seat post.
So if you were carrying something like a camelback to ride with, because it's easier to get the water, you're not, like you would say, carry the camelback, but don't shove everything else in the camelback. Then
if you're doing a long endurance, if you're doing like a multi-day event, I would try to avoid that. If you're wearing a backpack and you're only carrying water, that's not usually a problem for people. If you're carrying a backpack that's bulky with a lot of weight, that's more of an issue over time.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, Chloe, thank you so much for your time today. And we'll post in the group. I know you were willing to get a little bit more into some of the injury side and just exercises and stuff like that in a future session. So we'll kind of see what questions people have around there. And we really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.